Hey everyone. Hopefully you guys are doing well outside of the physical classroom and in the comforts of wherever we may be. So today we're going to talk about World War II from a U.S. historical point of view. So let's get right on into this. In this lesson, we're going to talk about major developments, the origins, and the domestic impact of World War II in the United States, especially the growth and the power of the federal government. So let me go back. As we kind of know, or stated in the previous video of Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Great Depression, New Deal, the United States does not immediately join World War II. They remain neutral, but of course, it's kind of an unwritten rule that we are more friendlier towards the allies of Great Britain and France, and we're also kind of strange friends with the Soviet Union at the time. Backstory: World War II. Adolf Hitler, who's becomes Chancellor of Germany, takes a lot of power, seen as a dictator. He takes control of Germany and he starts to invade neighboring countries, starting with Poland in September of 1939. And as soon as that happens, France and Great Britain declare war on Germany, while the United States, on the other side of the world, we kind of, pay attention to what's going on, but we don't send any soldiers at that time. So domestically, of course, the United States still has issues with social justice and discrimination. So one important person who is oftentimes not discussed in U.S. history as far as trying to advance civil rights is Phillip Randolph, or A. Phillip Randolph. He at one point was considered by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI, as the most dangerous black man in America. He was basically, he wanted to start out, began organizing large protests in Washington, D.C. long before Martin Luther King Jr. Over discriminatory hiring practices in national defense jobs. Because the thing is, in every single war that America has been involved in, African Americans, Black people have always been a part of every single war dating back to the American Revolutionary War. And so they're putting their lives on the line out in the battlefield, but at the same time, domestically, Black people were not considered equals in the United States, and as far as hiring, jobs, housing, schools, there's segregation that was going on, Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan that was terrorizing throughout the South. So times were tough. And so Ace Phillip Randolph, he was tired of all of this, and he tries to organize large scale protests in D.C. But before any of this was to happen, President Roosevelt issued an executive order declaring that the defense industry would not discriminate based on race, creed, color, or national origin. As pictured here, there's Ace Phillip Randolph along with Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady of the United States. Because at the time, 1941, World War II has been going on for a couple of years, so Roosevelt did not want on his plate a large-scale civil rights movement that could potentially interfere with focus on the war effort. So usually in the United States, it just seems that we can only focus on one issue at a time. It's either we focus everything on what's going on outside of the country, foreign wise, or we focus on what's going on domestically. And usually, when it's at a time of war, we tend to focus a lot more on foreign policy than domestic policy. So, of course, if we know a little bit about U.S. history, we know in World War II that the United States is going to go to war with Japan, or against Japan. So, why exactly is that? Dating back, 50, to 100 years ago, during the age of imperialism, many European countries were colonizing parts of Africa and, of course, parts of Asia. And so Japan wants to get in on this action as well. They want to be seen as a powerful threat to the world. And so they wanted to take control of parts of the Pacific Ocean, Pacific Islands, and other Asian countries as well, which they do in Manchuria, in China, in Korea, in Vietnam. And so basically, Japan as a country, it's an island country that was dependent on the United States for many natural resources that are very crucial, like oil, steel, and iron. But Japan also sees a rise in imperialism, and their emperor at the time, Hirohito, starts to gain a lot of control, and he places several top military generals to basically run the country, like Hideki Tojo. Japan starts to develop a close relationship with the Germans and the Italians, who were also seen as threats to the Western world and seen as an enemy to the United States. So the United States does not like what Japan is doing as far as striking a relationship with Benito Mussolini of Italy and Adolf Hitler of Germany. So the United States placed an embargo, or basically a ban on Japan, refusing to sell the Japanese precious airplane fuel and other goods which could be used for war against the British, who had colonies out in the Pacific. So Japan was upset with this embargo, and they also become allies with Germany and Italy as part of the Axis powers. So at this time in World War II, there are two sides to this. You have the allies, which include France, Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, while you have the Axis powers, which include Japan, Germany, and Italy. So after Japan invaded China, the United States reduced the amount of oil being shipped to Japan. So this is a map of the Pacific Ocean and the extent of how big Japan was able to colonize in Asia. So as you can see, they basically conquered all of Korea, the Korean Peninsula, into Manchuria, and then into a city called Nanking, which Japan commits terrible atrocities, killed thousands of civilians, raped thousands of women. It was not a pleasant time in China. Japan also conquers parts of Southeast Asia, French Indochina, where Vietnam, Cambodia, Malaysia is, also into Indonesia, where the Dutch East Indies were. So Japan was, at this time, the most powerful nation out in the Pacific in Asia, seen as a huge military threat. So as a result of the embargo, Japan wanted to take revenge and try to cripple the United States' Navy Pacific Fleet in Hawaii. So the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. They sank or damaged 21 ships and killed over 2,400 Americans. And immediately, the United States declared war on Japan the following day. So, as a response to this, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, his most famous speech of this, he called it a date which will live in infamy, and the United States is officially at war with Japan. So, as a result of the United States being on war or at war with Japan, President Roosevelt, he takes very specific actions against the Japanese. Let me minimize my screen here, if I can, potentially, or move it around. Sorry about that. So anyways, in December of 1941, President FDR issued an executive order requiring so-called enemy aliens, which included the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese, to register with police. So if you're German American, Italian American, or Japanese American, you had to register with local law enforcement. Shortly afterwards, the president lifted the order for Germans and Italians, but not for the Japanese. So this is always a controversial decision by Franklin D. Roosevelt. So the thing is, at this time, the United States is also at war with Germany, also at war with Italy, and of course at war with Japan. But why exactly were German Americans and Italian Americans lifted off of this order, but not the Japanese? And I'll tell you why. It's pretty simple. For me, I'll tell you this. I'm half Japanese, but I'm also half white. I'm half European, half Finland. My mom's from Finland. My dad's from Japan. So the reason why the Japanese Americans were still had to register with the police is quite simple: physical characteristics. I've told my students this before, that if you were to see me walking down the street, you're not going to confuse me for a white man. I'm always going to look Asian. It's just how the DNA, physical DNA, looks for me and other Japanese Americans, and that can't be changed. But for example, if you are German American or Italian American, your skin complexion is whiter, and it's more difficult to tell if you're German American or Italian American. So, for example, if you are German American and the police comes up to you and say, "Hey, are you German American?" You can easily tell them, "No, I'm actually French American or Swedish American or Irish American." How are they going to tell the difference? For me, physical characteristics, I can't hide the fact that, I have Asian descent or Asian ancestry. That's something that's not going to change. So that's one of the many reasons. And of course, it's unfortunate. We have, there's a lot of things in U.S. history's past that's not always so great. But anyways, the attack on Pearl Harbor made many Americans feel that the Japanese, including Japanese Americans, were a threat, even though there are many second, third, fourth generation Japanese Americans that have never set foot in Japan, may not even speak the Japanese language, but because they were Japanese descent, they were seen as a threat. And so, in response to this fear, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued another executive order creating the War Relocation Authority, the WRA. And scholars debate this all the time. It's very controversial. It's an internment camp that placed many Japanese Americans out in California, Colorado, many of these Western states, and they were basically in prison. Many Japanese Americans lost their family businesses. They were basically arrested and forced into these internment camps. So under this order, 90% of Japanese Americans living in California were forced to sell all of their possessions and relocate to camps in several Western states. And so the internment camps were challenged in 1944 under a Supreme Court case called Korematsu versus the United States. But it was upheld by the Supreme Court, which basically means that, hey, these internment camps are entirely legal. So the important thing to know in not just the United States, but world history as far as morality, important to know that legality does not equal morality. So, at one point, slavery was completely legal and okay in the United States. Segregation was completely okay. Having these internment camps was completely fine. And then also segregation was completely okay. So just because a law is a law does not mean it's always the right law. And so these are some examples of pictures of saying that, hey, Japanese people are not allowed here. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. And then there's another poster here instructing all Japanese people to register and move into these internment camps. Also, during the war effort, the United States signs on what's called the Lendlease Program that allowed the United States to send weapons to Britain if Britain promised to pay rent or return them after the war. This is always a funny one. The Lend-Lease program, the word lend, if you lend something to somebody, it means you borrow, you let them borrow something. And my question to this is, how do you borrow a bullet? Once you shoot the bullet out of a gun, it's no longer usable. So you're not borrowing, they're not borrowing it. You're basically selling it. And if a tank, if a tank here gets damaged, the United States is not going to want that tank back. So the Lend Lease program is not necessarily a borrowing program. It was more of a glittered coding, sugarcoating what's actually happening, and the United States is selling weapons to Britain. The United States government is not expecting the bullets and guns and planes and tanks to be brought back, especially if they're damaged. Like, who's going to do that? Oh, did I go too far? Sorry. The battle between the United States and Japan takes a huge toll. Let me move my screen so that it's not in much of the way. All right, so the Battle of Midway in June of 1942, it's seen as a turning point in the war. The Japanese planned on invading Midway Island in order to lure the U.S. aircraft carriers into a trap and destroy the remaining U.S. Pacific Fleet. However, unknown to the Japanese, the United States had broken their secret code and knew of the impending attack. So the United States had a lot of advantages compared to Japan in World War II. The United States had much more advanced planes and weapons. The United States planes could fly at about 2,000 feet in higher altitude compared to Japanese planes, which is already a huge advantage. Also, the United States took advantage of what's called Navajo talkers, and they were able to crack down on Japanese signals. And so the United States were well prepared for what the Japanese were going to do, thanks to the Navajo Native Americans. So during the Battle of Midway, the United States Navy sank 4 Japanese carriers and shot down 320 planes, which badly crippled the Japanese Navy. And so this battle is considered the turning point in the war against Japan after Midway, because the United States goes on the offensive against Japan. And so during the war between Japan and the United States, during these battles, both countries use a tactic called island hopping. And this basically means fighting happening in multiple different islands out in the Pacific. And this results in terrible casualties for both sides, especially for the Japanese. And so, yeah, there's some photos from the Battle of Midway. These are very tiny islands out in the Pacific Ocean. So, of course, there are 2 fronts to the war. There's the European front and the Pacific Asian front, but this is a map of what's going on in Europe. So, at the time, what you see on the left map in 1939, these are the locations of the Axis powers. This included Germany, Italy, Austria, and Sudetenland. And then 3 years later, in 1942, of course, Germany takes control, knocks down Poland, and then it goes in and conquers much of Europe. France ends up surrendering. So Great Britain is on an island on its own. Spain and Switzerland are declared neutral countries during World War II. Okay, so DDay happens. It was a huge turning point event. The Allies chose to attack the Germans in France on the coast of Normandy in France. The United States sends in thousands of troops, in total 100,000 soldiers and 23,000 paratroopers participated in the attack. So this invasion of France caught the Germans by surprise. And looking at the map, where do you think the Germans thought the invasion would land? Let me move my screen a little bit here so we can take a look at this map. So many people in Germany thought that if an invasion were to come, it may have been right over here in a small city called Calais, or basically in Dieppe. Basically, the English Channel is not too far away. That separates England from France. But one thing that helps England in World War II is, of course, geographically, England is an island, and so Germany could not stage a land invasion. So this protects and gives Great Britain valuable time to prepare for this invasion. And they have several thousands of troops from not just the United States, but Canada, Australia, India, Brazil. They all help in on the D-Day invasion. So this invasion caught the Germans by surprise, and this also results in heavy American casualties that occurred at Omaha Beach. However, the invasion was the turning point of the war in Europe. Within 2 months, the Allies had over 1 million troops in France. France would later be liberated and freed, and this would spell the end for Germany and Adolf Hitler. So here are some pictures. There is General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who will become president of the United States during the 1950s. So later on, with the invasion of Normandy, the Allied troops freed France, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And so all of a sudden, the Axis powers start to shrink and shrink and shrink. Uh, as American, British, and Russian or Soviet armies began to close in on Berlin, Hitler, who was a leader of Germany, committed suicide on April 30th of 1945. And once the leader is taken out, it's pretty much over. Within a week, the German army surrendered, ending the war in Europe, and it's known as Victory in Europe Day or VE Day. So domestically, the United States has a huge influx in war mobilization, which many car factories and industries start to focus their attention on building tanks and other vehicles and weapons used for wartime. So this is an example of wartime conversion. And also the role of women in the war is very important as well. And so these are some examples of some propaganda posters that was laid out in the United States. So for example, this one on the left, title says, "Of course I can. I'm patriotic as can be, and ration points won't worry me." So this is example of, the United States government sent a message that, hey, American citizens, please ration your food, save your food so that the soldiers can have something to eat as well. And also the one on the right, same kind of message. Do with less so they'll have enough. So save your resources, give them to soldiers so that we can fight in the war. All right, so this map shows about war mobilization. So to prepare the country for war, President Roosevelt created the War Production Board to help regulate the switch to wartime production. And so this map on the left shows automobile or car production during World War II. So of course, in 1941, most of that year, we are not at war, so we're producing millions of cars. But once we declare war on Japan, we focus in on building tanks. And so car production goes way, way down. So as the map on the right, tank production goes way, way up during World War II. So it makes sense for the automobile industry to do what is necessary to help during the war effort. Also, shipyards switched to producing what's called Liberty ships, which were wartime cargo vessels. Also, the United States government, mentioned earlier with the two propaganda posters, they send out messages that were asking Americans to ration or save and reduce the amount of goods they were using so that the materials and food could be used for the war effort. And so many messages were telling Americans, hey, grow your own food, okay, plant your own crops, try not to go to the store as much. Also, the role of women in the war industries. Most of the soldiers were men fighting overseas, and so women took over the factory jobs that were left behind to help the war effort. And so, of course, I'm sure we've all seen the Rosie the Riveter poster, "We Can Do It." It was the most famous propaganda tool to help get women into the workforce. Of course, recently, I think I heard that the original Rosie the Riveter passed away, which was unfortunate. For sure. So condolences to her loved ones and family. All right. So yeah, more propaganda posters and actual pictures of women working on airplanes during World War II. So women had a huge effect to helping the war effort. Okay, once Germany surrenders, of course, the United States still has to deal with Japan, and this is where we'll talk about the atomic bombs and its impact and legacy that it leaves behind. So the background of this: Japan's not giving up. And the United States at the time was secretly developing a nuclear weapon, a never before seen weapon of its kind called an atomic bomb. And so this secret project was called the Manhattan Project. This project costs at the time $2 billion, which would be $22 billion today. The project was so secret, in fact, that President Roosevelt, who's pictured up here, he did not tell his vice president, Harry S. Truman, anything. The relationship between Truman and Roosevelt was kind of distant. They didn't really get along too well, and Truman was oftentimes left in the shadows. But of course, Truman is suddenly given all of this news about the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb because President Roosevelt, he passed away on April 12th, 1945 in Warm Springs, Georgia. So President Roosevelt, throughout his life, he had a lot of health issues. He had polio. And so there are hardly any pictures of Franklin D. Roosevelt at all, like standing up or walking. Basically, his aides were with him all the time. Usually pictures of Roosevelt of him sitting and no cane in sight. He did not want to present a message to the American people that he was considered weak or handicapped. So Roosevelt, he dies in Warm Springs, Georgia, and Harry S. Truman becomes the next president of the United States. And all of a sudden, he has this plan of the nuclear weapon at his arsenal. So the United States conducted several test bombings to see how effective they would be. Some test sites included Los Alamos in New Mexico, Alamogordo in New Mexico, and then Marshall Islands out in the Pacific. And so the United States also tested it out on how devastating the bombs would be on Japanese built style houses. So let me move my screen here a little bit so that we can get some of the details. So there were two atomic bombs that were built called Fat Man and Little Boy. So Little Boy was dropped over Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945, and this killed 66,000 people. The United States thought that, okay, if we drop Little Boy, the Japanese would surrender immediately. The Japanese, however, do not surrender, which shocked the Americans. And so 3 days later, the United States dropped a second bomb called Fat Man over Nagasaki in August 9th, and this killed over 80,000 people. All in all, within the few couple of days here, there were over 200,000 casualties, over 140,000 deaths, and many thousands of more within the next few days, weeks, months, and years would die because of exposure to radiation from the bomb. And so Japan officially surrenders on September 2nd of 1945, also called VJ Day, or Victory over Japan Day. About 4 years ago, actually 4 years ago to this day, I was over in Japan on a study abroad trip with my Georgia State when I was at Georgia State. So we were in Hiroshima and I got to see the Genbaku Dome, which is the only remaining structure still standing from the atomic bomb drops in Hiroshima. I also visited the Hiroshima Peace Museum, which is a very sombering experience for sure. And I recommend anybody to go and visit Japan and check out the site. It's very, very telling, very emotional. And so this whole thing, here's some pictures of the impact and injuries caused by the bombs. And so this whole thing about World War II, it's very sombering. Historians debate whether or not the bomb should have been dropped, and there's really no right or wrong answer. There's just the facts of course, it's wartime, but also the bomb killed many more civilians than actual military personnel. So this is the only time that atomic bombs have been used, or nuclear bombs have been used on in the world, in world history. There are about 8 countries today that have these nuclear weapons capabilities, and hopefully we as a human race never have to witness this kind of devastation and the use of these weapons ever again. And so that concludes the PowerPoint and the lesson today. Hopefully this was useful to you guys. And until next time, be safe out there, and I'll see you guys soon.